Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the GSU Briefing, the official podcast series of the Geoeconomics Strategy Unit. Today, we are talking about a region that's become very busy all of a sudden, which is Europe, more specifically Eastern Europe, with Lauren here, our Eastern European analyst at the GSU. We have had the Trump EU transatlantic rift over Greenland. We've had the Davos summit next over the past week. And now, as of today, 27th January, when this is being recorded, you've had the EU-India FTA officially being announced. So, Lauren, before we begin getting into the geopolitics of it all, the international economics of it all, very busy conversation coming up. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a international policy fellow at the 16th Council, focusing mostly on Europe and a lot on Eastern Europe. You can't get away from it. And my training was I did an undergrad in international relations and then a master's at King's College London in war studies. So very conflict focused, but more of a focus on economics in my undergraduate degree. And then I worked for a time in defense consulting, and now I'm working here researching and writing and more short form and long form content.
That's absolutely fantastic. And I could not have thought of a better person to discuss this with. Because let's start with Greenland and Davos. You've had Trump at first threatening military force and then threatening tariffs. But at the conference at the World Economic Forum last week, he said that we have a deal with the NATO Secretary General, at least agreed in principle. So there is not really a requirement for tariffs anymore, let alone military action. So given your security background, why don't you talk to us a little bit about that when it comes to Eastern Europe? Is the continent more secure now, or do you expect geopolitical volatility to continue these risks over time?
Yeah, so I think obviously Trump has stepped back. He's made a statement that he wouldn't use military force, while also leaving a caveat that if he did, he would run right over anybody standing in his way, which I think is obviously still says quite a lot. I think the continent is more secure than if he'd invaded Greenland for sure, but is it more secure than before this all started? Definitely not. You know, NATO is ultimately the kind of groundwork for security in Europe for the last 80 years. And NATO's never looked so weak, you know. You have internal fights, you have threats of invading NATO countries from other NATO countries. Like, that's completely ridiculous. So, no, I don't think it's a very secure time. And that obviously is not good for Eastern Europe as the most threatened region in NATO. You know, you have Russia right on their doorstep. You have them flying drones and fighter jets over NATO countries over the last few months. And that might be provocations, that might be testing us. But it's a threat nonetheless. And no, I don't think Eastern Europe is very secure. Geoeconomically, that is obviously, you know, it's a risk. It could also be a bit of an opportunity. Everyone's talking about defense right now in Eastern Europe, massive funding growth in that sector. Ukraine is spending basically all of their money and also labor force on defense at the moment. But, you know, the problem is defense isn't really the only industry that you want. You know, I think that it could really take away from their other industries if you have such a focus on defense, you know. And obviously there is the risk that Russia tests with much more firepower. There's a highly likelihood that if Russia feels powerful, feels that NATO won't step in, they might invade a Baltic nation. I know that Estonia is terrified, and they're spending, you know, 5% of their GDP on defense. And they've got along their border and also Poland's border, they have massive anti-air missile protection and things like that. So they are ready for what is coming, but that doesn't mean just because they're prepared, their economy could really handle a conflict. I mean, they've got a lot of growth, and actually a lot more growth than Western Europe at this point. But a lot of that is funneled into defense, and other industries would definitely suffer in a conflict situation.
I understand. And the geoeconomic risk barometer that the GSU released earlier this month, we had a dedicated section for Eastern Europe. And of course, defense was a big part of it all. And we saw that compared to 2014, versus today, the amount of countries in Europe as a whole meeting the 2% NATO guideline has suddenly risen. Eastern Europe, as you mentioned, Estonia and a few other countries, much higher than 2%. How sustainable is that? Do you see that continuing for a significant amount of time in the future? Or is this something panic driven and conflict driven and it should subside very soon?
Yeah, well, I think obviously massive build-ups in defense is quite unsustainable. Defense is one of the most expensive industries. You're spending millions on small numbers of systems. If you're spending expensive, I mean, Poland bought a big anti-air system from the US that cost billions of dollars. So, is it sustainable to keep building up? At the rates that they're building up, maybe not. I'm sure that it will continue maybe at a lower rate. There's definitely a panic, but you can understand the panic when it especially comes to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, all of these nations that have seen massive jumps. You might consider they could continue that growth. I think Western Europe will, it's already kind of happened in the UK, and Germany's obviously just spent a lot of money, but the UK's already kind of clearly not going to reach our 3.6 GDP promise. So I suspect that will kind of filter around Western Europe, and those promises to meet those really high GDP numbers won't actually come to pass. But I think right on those Eastern European border countries, you definitely see sustained spending on defense.
Yeah. And I think you've so much money being poured into the sector. Where is it all going? We have had debates within Europe where if the defense spending should basically be used to buy European arms and therefore provide employment to European labor and boost European industries, or are we looking at more outward procurement from countries such as the US, Israel, and now, of course, with the FTA being signed with India, there's a lot more interest in our own defense systems as well here in this country. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, definitely there was a focus on European defense. The European Defense Fund you can only use on European defense. So there was a talk about excluding the UK from that, but they've now been included in that as well. So yeah, I think at first, but the capacity is so high, the demand is so high that they've had to turn to third country industries. They've been bringing in more US stuff, especially Israeli stuff, but there's questions around the usefulness of some of Israeli systems and the kind of reliability of them, especially Elbit systems. And I think that definitely with the FTA, I suspect there'll be a lot more interest in Indian stuff. I mean, it's just plugging the gap. I don't think they've reached a point where they don't really mind where it's coming from as long as it's coming, especially for Ukraine, who will basically take anything that is offered, and especially a focus more on cheaper, attritable systems rather than expensive US drones and stuff that cost £1 million a system. And, when they get blown up, you've lost all of that money.
Yeah, and I think we have to ask, what does it say about European sovereignty at this point? Because one thing that the war in Ukraine has really brought to light, brought into focus, was number one, energy security, with Europe really struggling with natural gas imports from Russia after that. And then food security, when Ukraine, the world's breadbasket, just couldn't export its stuff. The conversation around military that we're having right now, what does it say about technological sovereignty? I mean, it's not just about procuring enough equipment or ammunition. It's also about innovating them and developing them at home so that you're not reliant on foreign intellectual property for this for this critical industry and crucial equipment.
Yeah, so I think that is a problem. Obviously, it's not so simple anymore. You don't buy a gun and you shoot it.
You cannot develop this overnight.
Yeah, and also you're integrating any system you buy into a wider software, into a C2 network.
Yeah.
So anything you buy, you're giving access to your C2 network, which means that there's obviously a risk of bringing something in that is unreliable, unsafe. You don't know what kind of data leaks you could have. We're living in a time where the cyberspace is its own domain almost, which is why I think Ukraine is focusing heavily on developing their own software and C2. So Ukraine has the Delta system, which is a homegrown C2 software. It's all connected to your phone, basically. It's like an app. And this system is, there's talks of integrating it into NATO and NATO buying it from Ukraine. But I definitely think they have a focus on maybe less so in the kind of more hardware side of things. You know, they're very happy to buy weapons and systems from other people, but when it comes to software, where they're kind of more vulnerable, they've definitely focused heavily on at homegrown domestic production of that kind of stuff. So I suspect that Eastern European countries will soon be trying to purchase a lot of that stuff from them. It's also battle tested, which is a big plus.
Absolutely. I mean, you want reliability and you want that your investment really does yield dividends when it's a do or die situation, which I think we all agree Europe does find itself in now. So, given this, what should we watch for in the next quarter and the next year? Give us a time horizon and things that are happening in this sector, new developments that people should keep an eye on.
Yeah, well, obviously we're going to keep an eye on defense. That's a given. But I think there is a big software and tech startup kind of industry in especially Poland, Estonia, and Romania as well, that has been spending a lot of money there. So I think looking at these software development where it's dual use, you know, a lot of software, a lot of tech is kind of secretly defense, especially cloud services and things like that. So I think it'd be interesting to keep an eye on where the tech industry is going and seeing how that's going to be used for both civil and defense purposes.
Yeah, and I think the outward looking mindset of Europe really does become important over here now. And that's why deals like the one that they've just had with India become so important because you're not only looking at technology transfers, not only looking at procurement, but you're also looking at a much wider market that comes with a lot of second order benefits that are unlocked when you engage with them on a much deeper level through such agreements.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot more rebalancing, looking for allies in economics outside of the US as well. So, you know, I would look at Africa, I would look at other nations in Asia. I think that there's probably going to be a lot more engagement with them over the next few months slash years.
Sounds very interesting. Any particular thoughts on what's going on with regard to the India situation over here? Because you've done a massive trade deal with a country that you've been accusing of having close economic relations with Russia that is really fueling this
Yeah.
massive war at your doorstep, creating a lot of problems for you. I think it'll be very interesting to see how, when you mention crucial balancing between finding new allies, finding new partners, especially for sector oriented financial and economic engagements. How do you balance the geopolitics behind it? Because you have certain interests that you've got to maintain from a foreign policy standpoint, but there's also practical necessities that you at this point just cannot ignore. I mean, what else are you going to do?
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. I mean, accusations about India and Russia, you know, that's been going on. There's always been a kind of close relationship. India's always bought quite a lot of weapons and systems from Russia and also energy. But obviously, India talked about being less reliant on Russia for energy, which I think signals this kind of, it's not really playing both sides because if you're a neutral country, it's about doing what's best for yourself, you know, and it's about protecting your own interests. And I think Europe understands that as a continent that is always protecting its own interests as well. And I think that they are looking for new, wealthy, high production allies. And India is an obvious choice. And there's obviously last year the UK signed a big deal with India and now the EU, and you definitely see a rebalancing going on. I think that, you know, if you look at the kind of geopolitical, geoeconomic side of things, India is a good ally to have. It's a strong, large country with high production. So it wouldn't really make sense to alienate them based on long-standing relationships with Russia that, you know, a lot of countries have long-standing relationships with Russia.
Absolutely. And you're right with regards to the high production aspect of it and the amount of imports that the EU can now much easily bring in from India.
Well, the EU has, you know, the
Sorry?
EU has a manufacturing problem, right? There's manufacturing in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe has basically exported all their manufacturing abroad. So reducing these tariffs is key to keeping the flow of goods to Europe, I would say. Especially with what the US, you know, they're just, even though they didn't bring in the tariffs, they're just not a stable trading partner. You can't trust them.
Yeah, I think trust has really become this major aspect in all of this because when we talk about Davos, you had the Canadian PM Mark Carney very eloquently stating that if middle powers are not at the table, then they're on the menu, which is a very creative way of putting the current world order with, as we've been saying, the importance of these countries to really secure their own future because you've got so much instability right now. The socio-economic fabric of Europe was so deeply integrated with that of the US, and suddenly a disruption in transatlantic link has practically pulled the carpet from underneath most of these countries. And now you've got a scramble to secure energy, technology, and nearshoring, or at least friendshoring, some of these very, very strategic sectors that are crucial for growth.
Yeah, no, definitely Europe's on the back foot. Europe had been sitting, believing that they had their allies and alliances secure, and now you see people scrambling. They don't know what to do. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Europe probably should have diversified these things a while ago, but they thought the US was always going to be there.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I personally think that things like the new FTA are really exciting. You've got massive, massive upside for businesses on the ground because we often have this conversation that, when we speak about things such as geopolitics and the economic conversations that we have had even in the past few minutes, what does it really translate into on the ground? So, like I've been saying, you have got India's open access to European markets on 99.5% of Indian goods going into the EU now, and the European Union gets tariff-free access on 97% of imports. So big, big cut down. So for European businesses and manufacturers, that's a big plus. And I think the Eastern European region particularly will benefit from it because, as you said, that's where most of the industry is at the moment.
Yeah, manufacturing is a huge industry there. So obviously raw materials coming from India, things like that. I know India's a massive producer of steel. That's probably all going to be going to Eastern Europe as well. And in the defense industry, I mean, these raw materials are fundamental to building stuff. So it's symbiotic between the two regions. It makes total sense.
And the market is big. I mean, together, India and EU account for 25% of global GDP and a third of global traded goods. So that's a big tariff reduction on this massive chunk of global trade. And I think for critical sectors, we've been following what the FTA really entails for businesses on the ground. You've got automobiles, machinery, chemicals, pharma, all of these critical sectors that are very important to be insulated from global volatility. These should really benefit given that it is of shared interest, as we've been saying.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think there's any risks? Do you see any risks?
Yes, because if you look at the India EU FTA, people should not really assume that this is a supplement or a replacement for a deal with the US. It is very much important that we do not forget and do not become complacent with this one particular agreement. As I said in the introduction as well, this is just an announcement. The actual agreement needs yet to be ratified by the European Commission and the European Parliament. So that's going to happen later this year. And you've got massive volatility in the markets because of there not being a deal with the US. So it is very important that countries such as India really do get that thing locked down sooner rather than later to reintroduce some amount of confidence in the markets. You've got to support the INR, which is going to be crucial. So although the FTA is forward looking, it is quite comprehensive in its approach. I mean, apart from just tariff reductions, there's also other elements into it, such as a €500 million climate fund for India to be able to support sustainable developments at home. So I think that is really going to be quite important to look at and see how these things progress, because with an FTA, it's not overnight. You've got a reduction in tariffs. Most of these things happen over a long term, over a period of years. So you've got to keep your eyes on the ball and make sure that you're consistently shielding yourself from vulnerabilities that may keep arising.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there'll be an impact soon. I mean, this is a very volatile market, the Eastern European market, and hopefully these things can come in time and protect them from a potential, downslide if there is more conflict.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really crucial time to discuss these things. We've spoken about some very important aspects, and Davos was also filled with these conversations. What do you think is the future for forums such as Davos, though? I mean, when we talk about volatility, when we talk about great power competition, we talk about these assertive approaches to foreign policy, has the importance of multilateral forums such as Davos really diminished a little bit? People were following some conversations over there about what's next for such forums. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going into Davos, there was a big kind of is it dead question hanging over it. And I think lots of people, obviously, Trump is very anti multilateralism. He doesn't see much value in it, I don't think. And other countries are following him. I mean, the strongman is becoming more and more important. But I think in a response to that, the EU is pushing multilateralism more than it ever has before. It's expanding, it's setting up funds, defense funds, and innovation funds. This is cross-continent, cross-block work, right? I think that at the end of Davos, you maybe think those is Davos dead questions have been answered. I think that it had quite an impact this year. You have the speech from Carney. You have what Trump said on Greenland, stepping back. You think that Davos was the main stage for a lot of this stuff to happen. I mean, Carney before was kind of being quite loose about the deal with China. And then at Davos, he made a very clear statement. This was them trying to protect themselves from Trump. So you see that it's still pretty important. It's still a big main stage where these things are playing out. So I think forums will continue to be this kind of stage where world leaders can discuss things and make statements and things like that. But is multilateralism going to survive when you have one of the biggest leaders in the world very against it? You do have to think that is becoming less and less relevant. And I think the forums will suffer, maybe not quite yet. Everyone was quite quick to write it off this year. But, maybe in 5-10 years, you don't know what it's going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to have exceptional insight on Europe right now. I mean, over the past few months, ever since the war in Ukraine started, I've been stating in multiple forums that, Europe really now does need to pick up. As you said, it's been on the back foot, but I think they've come out swinging now, the Europeans, with trade deals, with participation at Davos being quite fruitful at the end of the day. I think Europe really does have some questions yet to answer on internal competitiveness and how it's going to catch up to countries such as the US and China and emerging technologies such as AI. But you did mention that they're looking at alternatives for critical technologies, especially when it comes to the defense industry with drones, etc. So you've given us quite a few things to look forward to in this conversation. And I would encourage our viewers to really keep following our work with the risk barometer, with these conversations, and of course the insights that we keep coming out with. We had one on Davos when the summit was ongoing. So I think at the end of the day, it is looking good. It's looking positive. It's all about keeping the momentum and keep moving forward on these issues, not getting bogged down. And like I said, not getting complacent with the progress that we're making. There's still lots to do. And I think with continued efforts, we're gonna see some fruitful results.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Europe kind of remembered who it was a bit recently, and then they remembered that they had the kind of GDP, number of people, labor force. They remembered that, and maybe not individually, but as a bloc, they can stand up to the US. They're trying. As you said, there's still some unanswered questions, but I think that they're not going down lightly for sure.
Very well, very well. So, Lauren, thank you very much for this conversation. A big thank you to our viewers, and more conversations coming on very soon.
Great. Thank you very much.